So we had a Zoom meeting tonight with 2 students, and for some reason it didn't record, and I'm concerned there might be others who couldn't make that meeting and are hoping to watch the recording. So I'm going to recreate the meeting as best I can, do a little bit of demo on loops, and we had a couple questions on functions. I might get into that in this recreation as well, although that really is next week's material. So I'm going to share my screen. So we have 2 types of loops or repetition structures in programming languages, and C# is no different. But there are a couple different variations of these. So we have what's called a fixed iterative loop. And fixed does have an E in it. Fixed iterative loop. And that simply means it's a loop that runs a certain number of times. A fixed iterative has a counter and starts at 1 value, and then each time through the loop it increases or decreases that counter until it reaches an end value that we have specified. So in C#, the fixed iterative loop is a for loop. And really in most languages it's a for loop of some variation. The syntax might be a little bit different. And in C#, we have in parentheses a counter. I'm going to use I as an integer equals 0, and then a semicolon. It's almost like there's 3 statements inside these parentheses. Then we're going to continue the loop until I, as long as I is less than 10. And then another semicolon. And my third statement here is I want to change the value of my counter. And I'm going to do I++. I++ simply means add 1 to I. So I'm going to increment I each time through the loop. And then I'm going to have some curly brackets. And inside that loop, we're going to have some repeated code. This is the code that's going to execute over and over again as long as this loop is running. In this case, it's going to repeat 10 times. I is going to start as 0, and it's going to do my code. Then I is going to increment using the I++ to 2, or I'm sorry, to 1. Well, 1 is still less than 10, so it repeats. And then I becomes 2. 2 is still less than 10, or I is less than 10. And it repeats until I finally becomes 10. When I becomes 10, then this loop is out of the bounds, and it starts or continues with the code after the loop. So let's say our code here is, we're going to take a list box. I'm just going to call it LST list. We're going to add items.add, and we're going to add the value of I.toString. And what we'd get in that list box is the numbers 0 through 9. We'll look at how we can modify these values and actually do a decrement as well as an increment when we look at Visual Studio and actually play around with this. But this is the for loop is the fixed iterative loop. Now there's also a conditional loop, and that's the while loop. And in while, we have some Boolean condition, and we have our repeated code. That is generated each time through the loop, or is executed each time through the loop. And we close our loop. Now the problem is this condition, if it's dependent on a value that's changing, then you need to remember to include some type of statement that changes the conditional value. Up here in our for loop, it's changing as a result of the third part of our for loop. But here, if we're using something numeric and that those numeric values are not changing, then we want to make sure we do that in our loop. For example, let's say we have a variable called n equals, let's make this an integer. So I'm going to say n equals 10. And we're going to do this condition while n is greater than 0. And we're going to have some code that repeats, but in that code, maybe we're just printing something, whatever we're doing, if it's not changing the value of n, we'll have what's called an endless loop. It will just go on forever and ever. And depending on ranges of values, it may eventually crash or it may just lock up our machine. So I need this statement here where I'm going to maybe say n equals n minus 2, let's say. And so now goes through the loop, runs our repeated code, and then n now becomes 8. 8 is still greater than 0, so it runs through the code again and becomes 6. 6 is still greater than 0, runs through the code again. Now n is 4. 6 minus 2 is 4. Still greater than 0, runs through the code again, going back through the loop, and becomes 2. 4 minus 2 is 2. Well, that's still greater than 0, so it runs back through, and now repeats the code, and n becomes 2 minus 2, or 0. And now as it's evaluating that expression, n is no longer greater than 0. N is equal to 0. And so again, it would exit the loop and run whatever statements come after the loop. There's another variation of this. I'm just going to copy this and come over here. And that is a do loop. So in a do loop, we have the expression at the end. And let's say n was 0. Well, if n was 0 up here, this loop would never run because we hit the while, and while n is greater than 0, well, 0 is not greater than 0. It ignores all this and continues the execution of the next statement. But in a do-while loop, we're guaranteed of running the code at least once. It doesn't matter that n is 0 because it doesn't evaluate that until at the end of the loop. So now as it goes through the loop, the first time through, it's going to repeat the code. N is going to equal n minus 2. So 0 minus 2 is a negative 2. And while n is greater than 0, well, minus 2 is not greater than 0. It exits the loop and runs the statement, or runs the statement to come afterwards. In this case, this is a great way of being able to get input from the user, and we're going to ask them to input something, and then maybe in the while loop at the end, we're going to verify that they entered something within the range that we specified. Maybe we say enter a number between 1 and 10. And if they enter 12, well, we're going to ask them again. If they enter a minus 5, we're going to ask them again until they enter a value where n is between 1 and 10. So those are our 3 main types of loops that we'll work with. There's one more, which we'll get to when we get into working with arrays and other data structures. But that one is called a for each loop. And a for each loop simply iterates through each item in a list or in a data structure. It could be an array, it could be an array list, it could be a dictionary. And we'll get to that loop later on. So it's another type of fixed iterative loop. Now, I will say some languages, such as Visual Basic, also have an until, where they do something until the expression is true. And we could simulate that here in C# by using the not operator. And so here I'm going to do an expression while n is, actually, let me get rid of the not for a minute. And let's do while n is, I'm going to change this while n is equal to 0. That would be a false statement. So n is 10. 10 is equal to 0 or is 10 equal to 0 is a false statement, this would never execute. But I can do this until n is 0 simply by saying not n equals 0. And the loop will execute until n is 0. So when you think about the not, if something is not true, it's false. And if something is not false, it's true. Now, I don't use this very often, but it's available to us. And we can do that not operator also in the do while. Well, let's jump over to C#. So in C#, I've set up a project. I named it Zoom Loop Demo 2 in this case. We're going to create a list box. And I'm going to get the font of this list box a bit bigger so you can see it better. I'll go 14 bold. And then I'm going to create a button. Let's name our list box. I'm just going to call it LST Demo. I'm going to code the button. I didn't bother to name the button, but that's okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take LST Demo, and we're going to clear the items. So items.clear. Get rid of anything that's in that list box. For int I equals 0, I is less than 11, and I plus plus. So this loop's going to start with I equals 0. It's going to continue until I is 11. And each time through the loop, we're going to take our list box, LST Demo, and we're going to add to the items the value of I.toString. So let's just try that. So I click the button, and I get the numbers 0 through 10. Each time through the loop, it added one number, starting with 0, and then it continued on adding or incrementing to the value of I until it actually it hits 10, and then it adds 1 to 11, and 11 is no longer less than 11. The loop ends. So we can change this a little bit. Instead of 11, let's do 101. And so now we're getting the range from 0 to 100. And you see it executes that loop very quickly. I'm going to go backwards. So I want to start with 100. And I want to do this as long as I is greater than 0. But instead of incrementing with I++, I'm going to decrement I with I minus minus. And now we're going from 100 down to 1. I'm going to change this even a little bit further and say I minus equals 5. So we're going to subtract 5 from I each time through the loop. Let's see what that gets us. And now we're going by 5s, 100, 95, 90, 85, so forth, down to 5. So that's how a for loop works. We can go forwards or backwards. For loops are great when you know a starting value and an ending value, and maybe the steps in between. Usually it's going to be 1, but not always. You can use a for loop to iterate through a list of objects. And if you don't know how many objects there are in that list, you can actually use the count or the length property, depending on what kind of list you're going through. All right, we can oftentimes interchange the while loop with the for loop. And I'm just going to comment this out. We're going to do the same thing with the while loop, except I need to create my integer I. We're going to say I equals, we'll go back to 0 again. And I'm going to do this while I is less than, let's just do 50. So as long as I is less than 50, we're going to run our loop. And here we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to add the items to our list box, or the value of I. And if I just do that, I'm going to get a whole bunch of zeros. And I'm in a loop because I is never changing. It's an endless loop. So I need to change the value of I. So let's do I plus plus. Could have done I plus equals 1, same thing. Now let's run this. And what we're going to get is the numbers 0 through 50. And there we go. Actually, I get through 49 because I'm doing it while it's less than 50. So if I wanted 50, I need to make this either less than or equal to, or change this to 51. So if I make it less than or equal to and run it, now I'm getting the range of numbers between 0 and 50. Well, maybe I want to know what the sum of those numbers are. And so I can create a variable here called sum equals 0. Mistype something and try to do guess what I was trying to say. Oh, I need to specify this as an integer. Sorry, int sum equals 0. And then we're going to take sum and increment it by the value of I. And then at the end of that loop, let's just bring up a message box. And here we're going to say the sum is, and we're going to concatenate the value of sum dot toString. Need my semicolon. And now let's run this. I get the numbers 0 through 50, and then it brings up a dialog box that says the sum is 1275. I'm not going to bother to go through and make sure that that is correct, but let's test this again. But rather than going to 50, let's just go to 5. So 6 plus 4 is 10, plus 5 is 15, and that's what we get over here in our little message box. So that's working. We can assume that 1275 from 0 to 50 was correct. So oftentimes I can use a while loop instead of a for loop. I can't always necessarily use a for loop instead of a while loop because sometimes that while may be looking at values that the user is entering. It's not necessarily a specific number of times that it's going to go through that loop. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to come back here and create another button. Move this one down. I'm going to create a label. And the text is going to be starting value. I'm going to duplicate that label, paste. This one's going to say ending value. And we're going to let the user specify what the end and start values are for the loop by entering it into a text box. I'm going to call this one txt start. I'm going to copy and paste, and we'll call this one txt end. I'm just going to put a value of 15 in here to start. Value of 20. So I'm going to go back to that first button we created. Let's just change our numbers here. So int start equals int dot parse, and I'm going to get txt start dot text. And I'm going to copy that line, paste, and we'll make a couple quick changes here. We'll change the start to end, and we'll change this to txt end. And I'll move my I down for a minute. txt end dot text. So I'm going to put the I below here. Instead of having it be 0, I'm going to have it be start. And I'm going to do this in as long as it is less than or equal to end. So I don't have to use numbers. I can use variables. And now I get the numbers 15 through 20, and the sum of those is 105. That second button I created, however, I want to allow the user to enter values into those two text boxes. Let's pretend for a minute that these aren't text boxes, but they're labels. And the user can't enter into a label directly, but they can through a dialog box using a button. Now, in Visual Basic, there was a cool dialog box similar to our message box, but it's called an input box. And the input box brings up a dialog with a text box the user enters something into, and it returns a string. That's not available directly in C#, but here's a little trick. I can go to the project menu and say add reference. And I'm going to add a reference here to Visual Basic, Microsoft.Visual Basic. I'm going to say OK. And then I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Save All. So I'm saving that reference. I'm going to come over here to C#, to my code, and I'm going to use or add a using statement of Microsoft.Visual Basic. Semicolon to end. Come back to my design screen. I'm going to double click on this button. And we're going to use a do while loop here. So I'm going to say do, and I'm going to have them enter a value. So we're going to say txt start.text. And you're going to pretend that this is a label. Txt start.text equals, and here I'm going to use Microsoft.Visual Basic, using IntelliSense, dot interaction dot input box. And I'm going to enter a prompt string here of enter the starting value. And then my title, very similar to a message box, is just going to be start. I'm going to repeat that if txt start.text, we're going to do this as long as it equals nothing. Now, when you do a do while, you have to put a semicolon at the end. And then we'll do the same thing for the end. So this is one way we can make sure the user is entering the proper thing. So we're going to say ending value. This is going to be txt end. And actually, maybe here I'm concerned. I want to make sure that the value they put in is less than the start value. Sorry, I got interrupted with a phone call. So I think we were talking about making sure the end value was greater than the starting value. So to do that, let's create a couple more variables here. I'm going to come here and say int start and end. And we'll say start equals int dot parse of txt start dot text. And so here we can say end equals txt start dot text. So that should be txt end dot text, and we would parse that as an integer. We're going to change our input box saying enter the ending value must be greater than start. And then our while, we're going to repeat while it's empty, although actually we'll end up getting an error if it is empty because we're converting these to integer values. Let's change this. Let's change a little bit more. Enter a starting value. Let's say greater than 10. So we're going to repeat this while start is less than or equal to 10. And then on this one, we're going to repeat while end is less than or equal to start. So this is how we can use a do while and just keep repeating, asking these are enter values until we get the entered value to fall within certain parameters that we've specified. So I'm going to start. Click button 2. Enter a value greater than 10. If I put in a 5, I get enter starting value greater than 10. So let's do 12. And then enter the ending value. It must be greater than the start. So if I put in 10 here, it's going to force me to re-enter. Let's see, I do a 5 again. It keeps forcing me to re-enter until I put in a value that is greater than the 12. So I put in 16. I say OK, and I get 12 and 16. And now I can run this other button to get the list of numbers and the sum using 12 and 16. So that's the way you might use the do while to get input from the user. Now you can also use a while in making sure you don't have duplicate values. And that's going to be the Lotto Picker assignment that you have in this this week's project. So I'm going to take a label. I'm going to give you a clue on how to solve that problem. So I'm going to put a value of x in my label. I'm going to make it larger so you can see it. We'll do bold 16. And I'm going to name that label LBL num 1. And I'm going to copy that label and paste it. This becomes LBL num 2. And we'll paste one more time, and we get LBL num 3. Okay, what we're going to have happen is we're going to randomly generate a number between 1 and 5 for each of those three labels. So I'm going to take a button here. We'll leave it named button 3. Down here, I want to change the text to 3 between 1 and 5. So I'm going to code this. We're going to start with a random number object. So random, we'll use R&D equals new random. Then we have 3 variables, int a, comma b, comma c. A is going to equal R&D dot next. I'm going to get a value between, or pass it a 5. It's going to give me a value between 0 and 4. So I'm going to add 1 to it, and that will give me 1 through 5. And I'm going to copy that statement and paste twice. We're going to make this B, and we'll make this one, the third one, C. So I'm generating 3 values randomly. I want to put those into my three labels. LBL num1 dot text equals a dot toString, and I'll copy that statement, paste, and we'll change this LBL num2, LBL num3, B, and C. Okay, so let me run this. And I'm getting three values. Each one is 1 through 5, or the range is 1 through 5. Getting three different numbers. Oh, but here I get duplicates. And I would like to avoid the duplicates. I got 2 5s again, 2 4s, 2 3s, 2 2s. The chance of getting a duplicate is fairly good, obviously. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. So how can I do that? Well, I could put all these statements and do it in a while loop while A equals B or B equals C or A equals C, regenerate those three. And that works for 3, but what if we had 20 numbers? I wouldn't necessarily want to do while A equals B or A equals C or A equals D or A equals E and so forth on through, like, say, R, and then do the same thing for all the others. It would just become really unwieldy. So here's the best way to solve this. We're going to generate the first number. That's guaranteed unique. And then we're going to do a do loop. Actually, we'll do this a little bit different. Let's do a while loop. I'm going to say B equals A and C equals A. And then we'll say while B is equal to A. Well, that's a true statement because we just set B equal to A. So as long as that's true, we're going to regenerate the value of B. And then I'm going to copy that. We're going to do the same thing for C, except we'll make this while C equals A, or my two vertical pipes, C is equal to B. So C has to be different from both A and B. And if it's not, we'll generate C again. So now let's run this. And I can sit here and click all day long, and I should never get three numbers or two numbers that are the same, much less three numbers the same. I should get three unique numbers, each one being between 1 and 5. So in the Lotto Picker assignment, you're basically doing the same thing, but you're going to generate 5 numbers that are between the values of 1 and 45 with no duplicates. I basically just giving you an easy way to program that. That's pretty much our discussion on loops. I had a couple questions about functions. And so, again, kind of duplicating what we talked about earlier, I'm going to show you a little bit about functions. And I'm going to come back in to this code. And we're going to add a couple statements here. I'm going to say int xyz equals 5. And then I'm going to create a function or call a function. Ignore the xyz equals 5. I'm going to go off on a different tangent here for a minute. So I'm going to create a function called change. Let's call it change form. So functions always have parentheses. So I'm calling a function named change form, but I'm getting a red squiggly because change form does not exist. I need to create that function. So we create a function. We're going to call it private. There's private and there's public, and there's a few others. Private simply means this function exists in this project or in this form, in this class. So private void, meaning it doesn't return anything. We'll return some values here in a minute. The name of my function, change form. And then we're going to do a couple brackets here. And I can tell what I wanted to do. So I want this function to change the background color, this back color equals, and we're going to say color dot yellow. And I'm also going to change the text of my form. So this dot text equals welcome to a function. Fix my typo. And so now what's going to happen, I'm going to comment this line out here for a minute. It's going to hit the change form, and when it does that, it's going to come find this method or function named change form, and it's going to execute this code, and then when it's done, it will return back. So let's run this. So I generate my 3 numbers, and then I'm getting a yellow background, and my title now is welcome to a function. Now I can pass values to a function. So I'm going to pass a value here of color.red. And this is called an argument. And then in my change form, notice I'm getting a little squiggly here because my change form doesn't take the argument. There's not a parameter. So here I'm going to set a parameter of variable C, which is of type color. And I'm going to use that value C in my statement of changing the back color. So here's what happens. When I call this, I'm passing color.red. It goes into the value of C, and I use the value of C to change the back color. So we should now see the back color of our form becomes red. And it does. I can pass it another parameter or another argument. So these are arguments that we're sending. The parameters are what's in the that's being received in the function itself. So I'm going to do a string here of t, and I'm going to pass it a string value, a new title. And so the string value goes into t, and we're going to change the text here to t. So I got a quote there. Let me get rid of that. And so now when I press this button, we get our 3 numbers, we get a red background, and the title has changed the text that we passed it. I could have the user enter a title here. So I'm going to go back up to my input statement, input box. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to say string title equals, and we're going to say enter a new title. For the form. And my title of the input box is something going to be title. But now what I want to do is I want to send it title, not in quotes. And let's try that. Get my 3 numbers. I'm now asking for the title for the form, and we'll say South Mountain. Click OK, and now I get my red background, and I'm getting South Mountain for my form title. So that's how we can pass values and receive values. We can do the same thing with numbers. We can also have methods that return a value. So I'm going to create another method here. This is going to be private. It's going to return an integer, and I'm going to call this one double it. And it's going to take an integer value, which we'll simply say x. And I'm going to take the value of x. I'm going to multiply it by 2. I'm going to say x times equals 2. And then we have a statement that says return x. Anytime I have something other than void here in the declaration of my method, I've got to return that value type. And x in this case is an integer multiplied by 2. It still remains an integer. I'm returning an integer. So now up here, we're going to take a value. Let's just take this int xyz equals 5. And I'm going to call double it. So we're going to say xyz. Let's just do a different variable. Let's say int abc equals double it xyz. And so what's going to happen, it's going to pass the value of xyz, 5, into x. X is going to double to 10. It's going to return 10. 10 basically replaces this and is assigned to abc. And to demonstrate that, let's just do a message box dot show. And we'll say the doubled value of, and we will take xyz dot toString. We're going to add to that, that's my typo there, string of is with a space, and concatenate abc dot toString. And my title will simply be doubled. Need my semicolon at the end, and let's run this. So type in test for the name of our form, and now I'm told the doubled value of 5 is 10. So once again, what happened in our code was it took int xyz of 5, it called double it and passed 5, the value of xyz, to the value of x. X was multiplied by 2, so it became 10. We returned 10. The value of 10, so it's returned here. It's assigned to ABC. And then in our message box, we show the W value of xyz, which is 5, is, and ABC, which is 10. That was our prompt, and our title was doubled. So that's how we can send a value and return a value from a method or a function. We'll get more into functions and methods next week. At this point, I'm going to conclude this Zoom meeting and wish everybody a good night, even though nobody's here because this is a re-recording. By the way, next week I probably will not have a Zoom meeting. I have other things going on almost every night, and then I'm out of town and may not have access to be able to run the Zoom meeting while I'm out of town. So I'll try to do some videos this week for the next week's projects, or if I can't do that, I will certainly find some other videos for you to watch from other people.